The humid darkness of Guadalcanal pressed down like a living thing on the night of August 23rd, 1942. The jungle was heavy with the drone of insects, the restless hiss of the Lunga River, and the muffled tension of men waiting in silence. U.S. Marines, dug into shallow trenches along the sandbar east of the river's mouth, gripped their rifles and stared into the black. They had been told to expect an attack, but few believed the Japanese would hurl themselves across open ground in such numbers. And yet as the hours bled past midnight, the first cries pierced the night, the guttural shouts of Japanese infantry launching a banzai charge, their boots pounding mud, their rifles tipped with long steel bayonets glinting in the starlight. The Americans answered with fire. Muzzle flashes spat orange tongues across the sandbar, the rhythmic thunder of the M1917 Browning machine guns chattering over the river. Grenades cracked, sending plumes of earth and bodies upward, but the Japanese kept coming, wave upon wave, their bayonets thrust forward like lances. Some fell screaming into the shallows, cut down mid-stride. Others reached the Marines' line, leaping into foxholes with guttural yells, slashing with their Type 30 bayonets that seemed more like swords than knives. In the blur of smoke and blood, close combat became savage, shouts and curses colliding with steel ringing against steel. The Marines had been trained for this, though few had ever expected it. The M1 Garand, heavy and solid, fired with a sharp, authoritative crack that tore through the dark. Unlike the bolt-action Arisaka the Japanese carried, it could fire again and again with no pause for a clumsy reload. But when the enemy drew near, the Marines fell back on an older instinct. With quick, sharp motions, they fixed their own bayonets, shorter, broader, thrust-designed blades that gave the Garand a new, menacing silhouette. And then came the order, firm and cold above the chaos. Forward! Drive them out! At dawn, the field revealed itself for what it was. A slaughterhouse. Bodies lay strewn across the sandbar, many slashed open by bullets, some twisted in frozen poses of desperate charge. Nearly 800 Japanese soldiers of Colonel Ichiki's detachment had advanced across that killing ground. Fewer than 100 would make it back alive. The Marines, grim and exhausted, rose from their foxholes, bayonets dripping with mud and blood, the weight of what they had endured etched into their faces. For the first time in the Pacific, the myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked. The Americans had not only held, they had counterattacked with cold steel, sending survivors reeling in disbelief. For the Japanese, this was a revelation. Their military doctrine was steeped in the code of Bushido, in the conviction that close combat with the bayonet was the truest test of a soldier's courage. From their earliest training, Japanese infantry had been drilled relentlessly in Jukendo, the martial art of the bayonet. They were told Americans, raised in comfort, would never stand in the face of a bayonet charge, that they would break, that they would cower. Yet here on the black sand of Guadalcanal, they found men who not only stood but surged forward with their own blades, silent and unrelenting. Eyewitnesses remembered the terror that settled in the pit of Japanese stomachs when the countercharge began. Marines, their Garands slung low, advanced with bayonets fixed, faces grim, eyes unflinching. Survivors later confessed that the sight of Americans wielding bayonets, after cutting down their comrades with superior rifle fire, was something they had not been prepared to face. One Japanese soldier wrote years later that it was like being chased by demons who had endless bullets and then came with knives. In that moment, fear shifted from abstract to visceral. The bayonet was no longer a weapon of Japanese pride, but a symbol of American ferocity. For the Marines, too, the battle left an imprint. They had fought hand-to-hand in the humid dark, hearing the guttural cries of men who believed death in service to the Emperor was glorious. They had felt bayonets scrape against helmets, thrust against rib cages, clash with their own blades. They had seen comrades fall in the mud, only to be avenged in an instant of primal violence. But when the dawn came, they also saw something else. The Japanese dead lying in piles, their myth shattered. Their aura of unstoppable spirit broken by American steel and American will. The larger war had only begun, but in those early weeks on Guadalcanal, the U.S. learned something crucial about its enemy. That fanaticism could be met and broken. That fear was not the Americans' burden alone. And the Japanese learned a truth they could not easily reconcile, that the bayonet, their proud symbol of martial superiority, could be turned against them, stripped of its mystique by men who did not romanticize it, only used it when needed, and used it well. The M1 bayonet itself was unremarkable in appearance, just over 10 inches of sharpened steel fixed to the barrel of the Garand. It lacked the ceremonial length of the Japanese blade, lacked the aura of a samurai's descendant weapon. But what it carried was something deeper, the efficiency of a nation built on industry, the cold pragmatism of a military determined not to be outmatched. On Guadalcanal, its presence marked a shift. For every Japanese soldier who had imagined an American shrinking back from cold steel, the reality was burned into memory. The Americans advanced instead, rifles barking, blades flashing. The Battle of the Tenaru was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological turning point. Colonel Ichiki's force had been told to crush the Marines, to drive them into the sea. Instead, they had been annihilated, and in their annihilation came whispers that spread through the Japanese ranks in the months to follow. The Americans were not only resilient, not only stubborn, they were willing to fight face to face with bayonets, with the kind of ferocity the Japanese believed was theirs alone. It was an idea as terrifying as the steel itself. As the sun rose higher over Guadalcanal that morning, Marines trudged across the sandbar collecting weapons, checking for any wounded still alive among the enemy. The air was heavy with the stench of cordite and blood. Some Marines muttered curses, others walked in silence, shaken by the intimacy of the violence. A few pried the long Type 30 bayonets from enemy rifles, holding them up with grim curiosity, comparing them against their own. The Japanese blade was longer, thinner, designed for the slash and sweep. The American bayonet was shorter, broader, meant for the quick thrust. The difference was more than design, it was philosophy. One was steeped in tradition, the other in practicality. On that field, practicality had triumphed. For the Japanese survivors who limped back into the jungle, the memory of that charge would never fade. They had gone forward certain of their own superiority, and returned hollow-eyed, haunted by the image of Marines driving at them with bayonets fixed, the impossible become undeniable. Their reports, carried back through the chain of command, spoke of an enemy who had broken the rules of expectation. In the dark, in the mud, amid the thunder of rifles and the glint of steel, the Americans had shown they would not yield, not even at the edge of the blade. The jungle fell quiet in the days after, broken only by the cries of birds and the distant rumble of artillery. But for those who had stood on that sandbar, nothing was quiet inside. Both Japanese and Americans carried the memory forward. The night charge, the crack of the Garand, the sudden rush of bayonets. It was more than a clash of weapons. It was the birth of a new fear. And in the Pacific, fear was as lethal as any bullet. Long before Guadalcanal, the bayonet was more than a weapon to the Japanese soldier. It was an extension of identity. In barracks across the empire, recruits spent hours each day drilling with the Type 30 Arisaka rifle, their bayonets fixed, stabbing straw targets until their shoulders burned. The weapon was longer than most Western models. Its blade stretched to nearly 16 inches, and it turned the rifle into a spear. Each thrust was accompanied by a guttural shout, a command from the instructor that echoed with something more than discipline. It was Bushido, the warrior's path manifest in steel. Soldiers were told their courage was measured not by how far they could shoot, but by how steady their spirit was when the moment came to look into an enemy's eyes and drive the blade home. To the Japanese infantryman, the bayonet was proof of superiority, a symbol of the empire's resolve against what they believed were weaker, softer foes. American training told a different story. At Paris Island or Camp Pendleton, Marines drilled with bayonets too, but the emphasis was never ritual. For them, the blade was a tool, an ugly necessity. Their instructors barked about efficiency. Aim low, thrust for the torso, finish the fight quickly. There was no poetry attached to the Garand's bayonet. Its purpose was survival and its use was practical. The Garand itself was the centerpiece, a rifle that spat 8 rounds of .30-06 faster than any Japanese bolt action. The bayonet was merely an extension of firepower, there to seal the last gap when ammunition was spent or distance vanished, where the Japanese imagined the bayonet as the spirit of the soldier. Americans treated it as another piece of gear, no different in essence from a shovel or a canteen, except with sharper consequences. Yet culture made all the difference. In the 1930s, Japanese propaganda films showed endless rows of soldiers practicing bayonet drills in perfect unison, blades flashing in the sun. Children in school were taught to admire the bayonet charge as the ultimate expression of bravery. Veterans of the Russo-Japanese War carried stories of steel meeting steel on the Manchurian plains, stories retold until myth hardened into doctrine. By 1941, when Japan struck at Pearl Harbor, the belief was cemented. No American raised on Hollywood and hamburgers could withstand the will of a Japanese bayonet charge. Officers spoke of it as an unassailable truth. The bayonet was not just metal, it was destiny. That belief collided with cold pragmatism in the South Pacific. American reports after early skirmishes noted the almost ceremonial way Japanese troops wielded their bayonets. They charged with cries of "Tenoheika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," hoping to terrify their foes with the sheer force of their spirit. But the Marines did not break. Their semi-automatic rifles barked faster than Japanese soldiers could close the distance. And when the gap shrank to feet instead of yards, the Americans did not cower. They lowered their own bayonets, shorter and sturdier, designed not to slash but to thrust with brutal efficiency. What the Japanese viewed as sacred, the Americans used with indifference, and that indifference was unnerving. Numbers tell part of the story. Official records from the Pacific show that fewer than 2% of combat deaths were caused by bayonets. Bullets and artillery did the overwhelming majority of killing. And yet, interviews decades later reveal that soldiers remembered bayonet encounters with a clarity that eclipsed firefights lasting hours. Why? Because the bayonet was intimate, closed the space between men, forced one human to end another's life at breath's distance. For the Japanese, that closeness was supposed to be their advantage. For the Americans, it became proof that they could master even the most primal test of battle. There were moments, whispered in veterans' memoirs, that exposed the psychological fracture. A Japanese conscript, years after the war, described the first time he saw Marines countercharge with bayonets fixed. It was as though their rifles had become tusks, he wrote. We had been told Americans were afraid of cold steel, but they came forward like beasts that did not feel fear. Another recalled his own terror, not at the length of the American blade, but at the look in the Marine's eyes. Determined, expressionless, unshaken by the closeness of the kill. What unnerved him was not just the weapon, but the absence of hesitation. On the American side, accounts carried a different tone. Marines spoke of the adrenaline that surged when they fixed bayonets, of the way training instincts took over. Some admitted it was the moment they felt least human, when fear blurred into violence. A few described the odd clarity that came with seeing Japanese soldiers falter in the face of their charge. Men who had been told their courage was absolute suddenly breaking and retreating. They thought they had a monopoly on guts, one Marine later said. But the Garand spoke, and when it was empty, the bayonet spoke louder. His words cut to the heart of the cultural clash. The Japanese had built an identity around the blade, but the Americans stripped it of mystique and turned it into simple, efficient terror. The deeper irony was this. The Japanese blade was longer, sharper, more refined. In contests of steel alone, it should have been the superior weapon. But superiority in war does not rest in steel. It rests in the will behind it. The Japanese expected awe. The Americans brought pragmatism. And when those two forces collided, awe shattered first. Survivors carried the memory with them long after the battles ended, speaking of how the Americans had used their own symbol against them, reducing sacred ritual to mere mechanics. In the silence of post-war reflection, many admitted it was the moment they realized their empire was not invincible. The conflict was no longer just on the battlefield, but in the mind. Each bayonet clash on islands like Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville chipped away at the myth that had sustained Japanese morale. For men raised to believe that spirit alone could triumph over firepower, it was a revelation, as cruel as it was undeniable. The Americans had firepower, yes, but they also had steel, and the will to use it without hesitation. The blade no longer belonged only to Japan. It had been claimed by the very enemy they had scorned. By 1943, Japanese officers noticed the shift. Reports from the field spoke of American bayonet charges breaking entrenched positions, of Japanese soldiers refusing to advance into the teeth of a Marine line bristling with guerans and fixed blades. The bayonet, once their emblem of dominance, was becoming a symbol of dread, and the whispers spread. If even the blade could not guarantee victory, what weapon of spirit was left? What certainty remained? The answer hung in the jungle air, heavy, unspoken, and damning. The September sun burned mercilessly over Peleliu in 1944, baking coral ridges into white heat and turning every movement into torment. Marines advancing across that brutal landscape were not fighting men so much as the island itself. Jagged coral tearing their boots, heat rising from the ground like fire from a forge, and Japanese bullets snapping through the air from unseen caves and bunkers. For hours the battle dragged on in bursts of gunfire and silence, an endless cycle of advance and halt, fire and crawl. The Japanese defenders, dug deep into honeycombed ridges, had abandoned reckless charges. Now they waited, concealed in shadow, forcing the Americans into close, suffocating combat. It was here, amid the jagged coral and the smoke of grenades, that the bayonet returned not as a ritual, but as raw necessity. The Marines, sweating and bloodied, knew their rifles alone could not reach into the darkness of a cave or the twist of a tunnel. When grenades failed to clear the enemy, there was only one answer left: fix bayonets and go in. Survivors remembered the moment before the rush, the metallic click of steel locking onto the barrel, the way the blade gleamed briefly against sunlight before disappearing into shadow. Then came the charge, short and brutal. Rifles fired at point-blank range, smoke choked the air, and bayonets thrust into the dark where figures lunged out screaming. In that cramped violence, the weapon was no longer an accessory to firepower, but the defining edge between living and dying. Japanese soldiers who had once believed themselves masters of the blade now faced a nightmare reversal. Marines stormed into their positions with guerans already emptied of rounds, swinging forward with cold, thrusting efficiency. The American blade was shorter, yes, but it was wielded with a determination that gave no pause. A Japanese veteran later confessed that the first time he saw Americans advance into a cave with bayonets fixed, he felt as if the earth itself had turned against him. We had thought the bayonet was ours, he said, but they used it as though it had always belonged to them. That admission, whispered years later, revealed the collapse of an illusion that had sustained the Imperial Army for decades. On Peleliu, the fighting left no room for distance. Men met in spaces so small that rifles became spears, the clash of steel and bone echoing in tunnels that stank of cordite and blood. Marines spoke of eyes locking in the gloom, of thrusts landing with shocking intimacy, of bodies collapsing at their feet. It was combat that erased pretense, reducing war to its rawest human form. And it was here that the bayonet's psychological weight deepened. For the Americans, it became proof they could endure even this hell. For the Japanese, it became proof that their enemies had stolen the very weapon they had considered their own. If Peleliu was a crucible, Okinawa in 1945 was an inferno. Here, on the last great island battle of the Pacific, the bayonet would emerge again in ways that seared themselves into memory. Okinawa was no swift clash. It was months of attrition, every hill and cave bought with blood. Rain turned the fields into swamps, artillery churned the soil into mud, and civilians crowded the battlefield in tragic confusion. Amid this chaos, close combat was inevitable. Marines and soldiers pressed into labyrinths of limestone caves where Japanese troops, desperate and unyielding, awaited them. And again, the bayonet spoke. Veterans of Okinawa recalled advancing into bunkers where the light disappeared and the enemy was only feet away. Garand fire thundered in bursts, then silence, then the scrape of boots against stone as blades thrust forward. In some tunnels there was no room even to swing a rifle properly. Men crawled with bayonets leading the way, every movement a gamble between life and sudden death. One Marine wrote that the darkness was filled with shapes more than men, shadows lunging out of shadows, met by the flash of steel and the grunt of impact. For the Japanese within those tunnels, who had been trained since youth to see the bayonet as their last advantage, the realization was devastating. The Americans were not afraid. They came anyway, their bayonets cutting through both flesh and myth. The human cost was staggering. At Okinawa, more than 12,000 Americans died, and over 100,000 Japanese perished, many of them in close-quarter fighting that stripped away any illusion of distance. Yet within those numbers lay countless unrecorded encounters, where the bayonet became the final arbiter. Marines remembered comrades lost to sudden thrusts, but they also remembered the grim triumph of survival, the way their own bayonets drove the enemy back into darkness. The Japanese remembered something else, the horror of seeing an enemy they had dismissed as weak wield the blade with equal, sometimes greater ferocity. A weapon once believed to embody Japanese spirit had become the mark of American relentlessness. For the Americans, these encounters hardened a reputation already forming. The Marines especially carried the story of Peleliu and Okinawa into legend, telling of bayonet charges that shattered bunkers, of counter-thrusts that broke last defenses. The bayonet became part of their lore, not as a frequent killer, but as a symbol of determination, of the willingness to meet the enemy on his own chosen ground and still prevail. It was never romanticized, never held as sacred, but it was remembered as proof that no weapon, however ancient, could shield the Japanese from defeat. The Japanese, by contrast, carried the memory as something darker. Veterans admitted in post-war interviews that American bayonet charges had left them shaken, more than machine guns or artillery ever had. Those weapons were expected. But the bayonet was not supposed to belong to the Americans. It was supposed to be theirs, the Empire's edge. Watching it turned against them was like watching their own reflection betrayed. One officer described it as a thief of courage, stealing not just lives but the very certainty of superiority. In these island battles, the bayonet became more than steel. It became a psychological reversal, a weapon that dissolved myths. At Peleliu and Okinawa, it was not the number of men killed by blades that mattered, but the number of minds broken by the sight of them. Marines advancing with fixed bayonets, faces set and unyielding, embodied a message louder than any shout. The Americans would not flinch. And when the Japanese saw that message repeated again and again in the flesh, their own conviction began to waver. When the last echoes of battle faded from Okinawa's cliffs, both sides carried scars that would never heal. For the Americans, the bayonet was a reminder of survival, of courage measured in inches. For the Japanese, it was a haunting symbol of lost certainty. The very blade they had once believed sacred had been stripped of its aura and turned into proof of their own undoing. And as whispers of surrender drifted through the ruins of the Pacific, one truth lingered. The bayonet, simple and brutal, had become a weapon of the mind as much as of the body. The war ended in fire and surrender. But the memories of steel lingered long after the guns fell silent. In the ruins of Tokyo, veterans of the Imperial Army carried ghosts that would not leave them. For many, the bayonet was the sharpest ghost of all, not the sword of the samurai they had been taught to revere, but the shorter, brutal blade of the Americans that had chased them through jungles and caves. Letters written years later speak of the shame that clung to them. Shame not only in defeat, but in realizing that the symbol they had been told embodied Japanese spirit had been mastered by their enemies. The bayonet was supposed to be the weapon that defined courage. Instead, it had become the proof of fear. American veterans, by contrast, remembered it with a mixture of grim pride and unease. In VFW halls decades later, when stories turned to Guadalcanal or Peleliu, some men spoke of firefights, others of artillery barrages. But the ones that made the room fall silent were the bayonet stories, the moments when the enemy was close enough to smell, close enough to hear breathing, close enough that survival depended on the thrust of steel. These tales were never told with bravado. They were told with the gravity of men who had touched the war's most intimate violence. "Bullets kill from afar," one Marine explained in a post-war interview. "But the bayonet teaches you how close death really is." That closeness stayed with them long after the battlefield had been left behind. Statistics could never capture that weight. Military records showed that bayonet wounds were a fraction of casualties in the Pacific. Artillery and small arms fire accounted for nearly everything. And yet, commanders on both sides noted how often bayonets were mentioned in after-action reports, how often their presence shifted morale. A Japanese officer wrote bitterly in 1943 that his men feared the American bayonet more than their machine guns, a confession that carried its own sting of humiliation. The Americans, meanwhile, quietly folded the bayonet into their mythology, not as a common killer, but as a symbol of refusal, of grit pressed to the edge. That mythology seeped into training long after the war. At Paris Island, recruits in the 1950s and 60s still practiced bayonet drills under the scorching sun, the words of their drill instructors echoing with the memory of the Pacific. Each thrust was meant to remind them not only of combat, but of history, that their predecessors had faced an enemy who thought Americans would never wield steel, and proved him wrong. The bayonet was no longer simply a tool. It had become a lesson carved into muscle memory. Never yield, never hesitate, never allow an opponent's myth to stand unchallenged. For the Japanese, the legacy was more complicated. In post-war Japan, the bayonet was remembered less as a proud symbol, and more as a relic of a militarism that had led the nation to ruin. Museums displayed the long Type 30 bayonets behind glass, alongside uniforms and faded photographs, artifacts of a time when spirit was trusted to conquer industry. The veterans who had once trained by the thousands with those blades now walked past them in silence, knowing that the aura had been stripped away. Some whispered to their families about the night charges, the American counterattacks, the way the shorter blade of the Garand seemed to pierce not only bodies, but belief itself. For many, it was not the physical defeat that haunted them, but the psychological one. The irony grew sharper with each retelling. Japan, the nation of the samurai, had imagined its soldiers as inheritors of the sword spirit. Yet it was the Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Ohio, fishermen from New England, who had used the bayonet to redefine the war's most personal violence. The Americans had not sought glory in it. They had sought survival, and in that pursuit, they had taken the weapon meant to embody Japanese superiority and turned it into an instrument of American resolve. That reversal struck deeper than statistics or strategy. It rewrote identity. Survivors on both sides bore witness to this reversal in their own way. A Marine on Okinawa recalled years later that when he saw Japanese soldiers break at the sight of a bayonet charge, he understood something he could not put into words then, that myths can die faster than men. A Japanese veteran, his voice trembling in an oral history decades after the war, admitted that he had not feared the bullet. It was impersonal, inevitable. But he had feared the American with the bayonet. It was not supposed to be theirs, he said softly. When they used it, we knew we were no longer special. That admission distilled the emotional truth of the Pacific conflict. More cutting than any blade. By the time peace settled, the bayonet's place in history had shifted from battlefield weapon to cultural symbol. For Americans, it joined the pantheon of icons, the Garand's ping, the Marine's helmet, the flag on Iwo Jima, as part of the story of victory. For Japanese, it lingered as a reminder of illusions broken, of a pride undone by the enemy's unflinching advance. The blade itself had not changed. Steel was steel, but the meaning carved into it had been altered forever. What once stood for the Bushido spirit now stood for its undoing, even decades later. When the Pacific battlefields grew quiet under jungle growth and coral ridges stood empty, visitors walking through museums or war cemeteries could sense the weight. The bayonet displayed in glass was not just a piece of steel. It was memory embodied. It was the sound of men fixing blades at dawn on Guadalcanal, the sight of Marines charging into caves on Peleliu, the silence of Okinawa's tunnels where shadows met shadows. It was fear and survival, pride and humiliation, victory and loss, all balanced on a single edge. The legacy of the blade was never about numbers. It was about perception, about the stories men carried home and the truths they revealed in whispers years later. The Japanese had believed the bayonet was theirs alone. The Americans had shown it belonged to no one. In war, symbols are as powerful as weapons, and sometimes they are the same. The bayonet in the Pacific was such a symbol, one that pierced deeper than flesh, one that reshaped how enemies saw themselves and each other. As history faded into memory, the lesson endured. Myths can sustain armies, but they can also betray them. Belief in superiority can be as dangerous as any enemy. And when steel met steel on the ridges of Peleliu, in the mud of Okinawa, on the sands of Guadalcanal, that lesson was written in blood. The Japanese infantry who once drilled endlessly with their bayonets carried into war the certainty of dominance. They left with the memory of Americans who met them at the edge and did not yield. And in that memory lay the quiet, devastating truth. The blade, once sacred, had become their undoing.